It was a cool autumn night, and I found myself cruising down the iconic Route 66 in my trusty semi-truck. The stretch between Amarillo, Texas, and Albuquerque, New Mexico, is known for its long, lonely roads, and tonight was no exception. The darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond my headlights, creating an eerie atmosphere that had me on edge. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the highway broken only by the occasional passing car or the dim lights of small towns in the distance. The radio kept me company, playing a mix of classic rock and country tunes that echoed through the cab. I was looking forward to reaching Albuquerque, where I planned to grab a much-needed rest at a truck stop I frequented. As I passed through Tucumcari, New Mexico, I noticed the fuel gauge dipping lower than I was comfortable with. I decided to make a quick stop at a gas station just outside the town. The place was deserted, save for a sleepy-looking attendant who barely acknowledged my presence. I filled up the tank, grabbed a coffee, and hit the road again, feeling a bit more alert. The coffee did its job, keeping me awake as I continued west. The landscape changed gradually, the flat plains giving way to more rugged terrain as I approached the outskirts of Albuquerque. The city lights were still a good hour away, and the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. It was around 2 a.m. when I noticed something unusual up ahead. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, I saw a car pulled over on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking frantically. The yellow flashes cut through the darkness, creating an unsettling strobe effect. My first instinct was to keep driving. After all, you hear stories about highway robberies and carjackings all the time. But then I saw a woman standing next to the car, and she looked distressed. I couldn't just leave her there in good conscience. I slowed down and pulled up behind her car, leaving enough distance between us just in case. As I came to a stop, I took a moment to assess the situation. The woman was middle-aged, maybe in her late 40s, with shoulder-length brown hair. She was wearing jeans and a light jacket, which seemed appropriate for the cool night air. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck, keeping my senses alert. As I approached, I called out to ask if she needed help. The woman turned to face me, and I could see the relief wash over her features. She explained that her car had suddenly died, and she couldn't get it to start again. As I got closer, I started to feel uneasy. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. The woman kept glancing over her shoulder nervously, as if expecting someone or something to appear at any moment. Her behavior made me increasingly anxious, and I found myself scanning the surrounding darkness, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. I was about to offer to take a look at her car when a truck came barreling down the highway. Its headlights illuminated the area briefly, and in that moment, the woman's demeanor changed completely. She suddenly became frantic, urging me to get back in my truck immediately. Confused and alarmed by her sudden change in behavior, I didn't hesitate. I sprinted back to my semi, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached for the door handle, I heard movement behind me. Glancing back, I saw two men emerging from the darkness near the woman's car. One of them was holding what looked like a knife, its blade glinting in the faint light of the hazard signals. I scrambled into the cab, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I caught a glimpse of the woman in my side mirror. She gave me a slight nod, a look of resignation on her face. I didn't waste any time. I put the truck in gear and took off, my tires screeching against the asphalt. In my rearview mirror, I could see the two men running towards where I had been parked, but they quickly disappeared into the darkness as I sped away. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It slowly dawned on me that I had narrowly escaped what was likely an attempted robbery or worse. The woman must have been working with those men, acting as a decoy to lure in unsuspecting travelers. I drove for what felt like hours, constantly checking my mirrors to make sure I wasn't being followed. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of Albuquerque that I finally felt safe enough to slow down. I pulled into the first well-lit truck stop I could find, my hands still trembling as I put the vehicle in park. Once I had calmed down a bit, I knew I had to report what had happened. I called the local police department and relayed the entire incident to them. The officer on the phone seemed concerned and told me they'd send a patrol car to the area to investigate. As I sat there in the truck stop parking lot, waiting for the police to arrive and take my statement in person, I couldn't help but reflect on how differently the night could have turned out. If that other truck hadn't passed by when it did, illuminating the scene and causing the woman to break character, I might have become another statistic, another victim of highway crime. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. I gave them a detailed description of the woman, the two men, and the location where it all went down. The officers informed me that there had been a series of similar incidents reported along that stretch of Route 66 in recent months. Apparently, a gang had been using this tactic to rob and sometimes assault unsuspecting Good Samaritans. After giving my statement, I was too wired to sleep. I decided to grab some food at the truck stop diner and try to process everything that had happened. As I sat there, nursing a cup of coffee and picking at a plate of eggs and toast, I struck up a conversation with a fellow trucker at the counter. I shared my experience with him, and he listened intently, shaking his head in disbelief. He told me I was lucky to have gotten away unscathed. Apparently, he knew a guy who had fallen for a similar trap a few months back and ended up in the hospital with a concussion and a few broken ribs. We talked for a while about the dangers of the road and how important it is to stay vigilant, especially during those long night drives. He shared some of his own close calls, and I found myself feeling a strange sense of camaraderie with this stranger. There's something about the trucking life that bonds us together, a shared understanding of the unique challenges and risks we face out on the open road. As the sun began to rise, casting a warm glow through the diner windows, I decided it was time to get back on the road. I had a delivery to make in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I couldn't afford to fall behind schedule. I said goodbye to my newfound friend and headed back to my truck, feeling a mix of exhaustion and lingering adrenaline. Before I left, I called my dispatcher to let them know what had happened, and to see if I could adjust my route to avoid that particular stretch of highway on my return trip. They were understanding and agreed to reroute me through a busier, more well-lit area for the journey back. As I pulled out of the truck stop and merged onto I-40 heading west, I couldn't help but feel a renewed appreciation for the importance of trusting my instincts. That uneasy feeling I had when I first approached the woman's car was my gut trying to warn me of danger. In the future, I vowed to pay more attention to those intuitions. The rest of my trip to Flagstaff was uneventful, but I remained hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every time I saw a vehicle pulled over on the side of the road, I felt a twinge of anxiety. I knew I couldn't let fear control me. After all, there are genuinely people out there who need help. But I also knew I needed to be more cautious in how I approach these situations. It was one of those nights that seemed to stretch on forever. I was hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Houston, and I found myself on the lonely stretch of I-10 between Phoenix, Arizona, and Blythe, California. The desert night was pitch black, with only my headlights cutting through the darkness. I'd left Phoenix a few hours earlier after grabbing a quick dinner at a truck stop just off the highway. The place had been bustling with fellow truckers, all of us sharing that unspoken camaraderie that comes with life on the road. I'd chatted with a couple of guys about road conditions and the best places to stop for a good meal along the route. Little did I know that those casual conversations would be the last human interaction I'd have for a while. As I settled into the monotonous rhythm of the highway, my mind wandered. I thought about my family back home in Tennessee, wondering what they were up to. My daughter had a big soccer game coming up, and I was disappointed I wouldn't be there to see it. It's one of the downsides of this job, missing out on those important moments. But it puts food on the table and keeps a roof over our heads, so I try not to complain too much. The clock on my dashboard read 1:30 a.m. when I first noticed how truly desolate this stretch of road was. I hadn't seen another vehicle in what felt like hours. The vastness of the desert seemed to swallow everything, leaving just me, my truck, and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out before me. I'd driven this route countless times before, but something about this night felt different. Maybe it was the new moon that left the sky impossibly dark, or perhaps it was just my imagination running wild in the early morning hours. Whatever it was, I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, my eyes straining to see beyond the reach of my headlights. It was around 2 a.m. when I saw it, a flickering light in the distance. At first I thought it might be my eyes playing tricks on me. After all, when you've been staring at the same unchanging landscape for hours on end, your mind can start to conjure up all sorts of things. But as I got closer, I realized it was real. Someone was out there in the middle of nowhere, waving what looked like a flashlight. My first instinct was to keep driving. In this job, you learn pretty quickly that stopping for strangers in the middle of the night isn't always the safest choice. But as I got closer, I could make out the shape of an old RV parked on the shoulder and an elderly man frantically waving his arms. I slowed down, my heart rate picking up as I debated what to do. The man looked distressed, and I couldn't in good conscience just drive by if someone needed help. I'd want someone to stop for me or my family if we were ever in trouble. So, against my better judgment, I eased my rig onto the shoulder and came to a stop a little ways behind the RV. As I put the truck in park, I took a moment to survey the scene. The RV was an older model, probably from the 80s, with faded paint and a slightly rusted exterior. It had clearly seen better days. The old man was still waving his arms, now moving towards my truck. I grabbed my cell phone, planning to call for help if needed, but noticed I had no signal. Great, I thought. Just my luck to stop in the one place with no coverage. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I was bigger and stronger than this old-timer, and stepped out of the cab. The desert air hit me like a wall of heat, even in the middle of the night. I could hear the old man shouting as I approached, saying something about his wife having a heart attack. My pace quickened as the severity of the situation sank in. As I got closer, I got a better look at the man. He was probably in his 70s, with wispy white hair and weathered skin that spoke of a life spent outdoors. He was wearing pajama bottoms and a faded t-shirt, as if he'd been woken up suddenly. The panic in his eyes was real, and any doubts I had about stopping quickly evaporated. I told him I'd radio for an ambulance, and he nodded frantically, pointing towards the RV and telling me his wife was inside. I jogged back to my truck and used the CB radio to call for help, giving our location as best I could. The dispatcher assured me they'd send an ambulance right away, but warned it might take a while given our remote location. With help on the way, I hurried back to the RV, ready to offer whatever assistance I could until the professionals arrived. The old man had disappeared inside, so I followed, calling out to let them know I was entering. What I found inside stopped me dead in my tracks. the RV was empty. Not just devoid of people, but completely bare. There was no furniture, no personal items, nothing to indicate anyone had been living there. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, and I could see cobwebs in the corners. My blood ran cold as I realized something was very, very wrong. I called out for the old man, but got no response. The only sound was the wind whistling through a cracked window. Panic started to set in as I backed out of the RV. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the old man, but he had vanished into thin air. The desert stretched out in all directions, offering no clues as to where he could have gone. I sprinted back to my truck, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached for the door handle, I heard a sound behind me, a soft shuffle like footsteps on sand. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty RV and the vast, dark desert. I didn't waste another second. I jumped into the cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled back onto the highway, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel straight. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the old man or something worse following me. It wasn't until I'd driven for about 20 minutes that I felt safe enough to slow down and try to process what had just happened. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I so tired that I'd hallucinated an entire encounter? But no, the RV had been real. I'd seen it, touched it, been inside it. So where had the old man gone? And why would someone set up such an elaborate ruse in the middle of nowhere? As the adrenaline began to wear off, exhaustion hit me like a ton of bricks. I knew I needed to stop soon, but the thought of pulling over anywhere near where I'd had that strange encounter filled me with dread. I decided to push on to the next town, where I could find a well-lit truck stop and hopefully get some answers. I reached Blythe just as the first hints of dawn were starting to lighten the sky. I pulled into a truck stop, relieved to see other vehicles and people milling about. After parking, I sat in my cab for a few minutes, trying to collect my thoughts. Finally, I worked up the courage to go inside. The girl at the counter gave me an odd look as I approached, and I realized I must have looked a mess, pale, sweaty, and wide-eyed with fear and exhaustion. I asked if I could use their phone to call the highway patrol, as my cell still had no signal. The next hour was a blur of questions and explanations. I told the highway patrol officer everything that had happened, from the flickering light to the empty RV to the vanishing old man. He listened patiently, taking notes and asking for clarification on certain points. When I finished my story, the officer's face was grim. He told me that while they hadn't received any reports of an RV or a medical emergency in that area, my story wasn't entirely unique. Apparently, several truckers had reported strange occurrences along that stretch of I-10 over the past few months. Some had seen hitchhikers that disappeared when approached. Others had encountered vehicles that seemed to vanish into thin air. A few had even reported experiences similar to mine, people in apparent distress who lured them to stop, only to disappear without a trace. The officer explained that they suspected it might be the work of smugglers or thieves, using elaborate setups to target truckers and travelers. He commended me for trusting my instincts and getting out of there when things felt off, saying that others hadn't been so lucky. As I sat there in the truck stop, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to make sense of it all, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and lingering fear. I was safe, but the whole experience had shaken me to my core. It was a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities we face out here on the open road, where help can be hours away and danger can take many forms. I spent the rest of the day at the truck stop, too rattled to continue my journey just yet. I called my dispatcher to explain the situation, and thankfully they were understanding. They agreed to reassign my load and gave me a couple of days off to recover. In the end, I never did find out the truth behind what happened that night. Was it really a trap set by criminals? Some kind of elaborate prank? Or was there a more mundane explanation that I was too panicked to see at the time? I'll probably never know for sure. It was a chilly autumn night a few years back, and I found myself cruising down I-80 through Nebraska. I'd been on the road for days, hauling a load of auto parts from Chicago to Denver. The monotony of the Midwest landscape had started to wear on me. Endless fields, stretching out on either side of the highway, occasionally broken up by small towns that seemed to appear and disappear in the blink of an eye. I'd left Des Moines earlier that day, planning to make it to North Platte before calling it a night. But as the hours ticked by and the miles rolled under my wheels, fatigue began to set in. The white lines on the road started to blur, and I knew I needed to find a place to rest soon. It was just past midnight when I saw the sign for an upcoming rest stop. I can't remember the exact name, but it was one of those older stops, the kind that's been around since the early days of the interstate system. As I took the exit, I noticed how deserted the place looked. There were no other vehicles in sight, not even the usual assortment of fellow truckers catching some shut-eye. I pulled into the parking area, the gravel crunching under my tires. The place was dimly lit, with only a few flickering lampposts casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but at that point, I was too tired to care. I just needed a few hours of sleep before continuing on my journey. As I shut off the engine, the silence of the night enveloped me. It was the kind of quiet you only find in the middle of nowhere, so complete that it almost has a weight to it. I sat there for a moment, letting the stillness wash over me, when something caught my eye. There was a faint light coming from the bathroom building across the parking lot. It was barely noticeable, just a soft glow emanating from one of the windows. At first, I thought it might be a security light or something left on by the maintenance crew, but something about it seemed off. I debated whether to investigate. On one hand, my exhaustion was telling me to just lock up and get some sleep. On the other, curiosity was getting the better of me. Plus, I figured it might be another traveler in need of assistance. In our line of work, we look out for each other. You never know when you might be the one needing help on a lonely stretch of road. Decision made, I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and climbed down from the cab. The night air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of dry leaves and distant farmland. As I made my way across the parking lot, the beam of my flashlight danced across the ground, illuminating discarded wrappers and empty bottles. Clearly, this rest stop hadn't seen a cleaning crew in quite some time. As I approached the bathroom building, the feeling that something wasn't right grew stronger. The light I'd seen from my truck was coming from the men's room, a weak, flickering glow that seemed to pulse erratically. I called out, asking if anyone was there, but my voice just echoed off the concrete walls, unanswered. With a deep breath, I pushed open the door to the men's room. The hinges creaked loudly, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. As the door swung open, I was hit by a musty smell, like old water and mildew. The flickering light I now saw was coming from a small flashlight that had been left on the floor near one of the stalls. But it wasn't just the flashlight that caught my attention. Scattered around it was a collection of personal items, a backpack, some clothes, a few books, and various toiletries. It looked like someone had unpacked their entire life onto the grimy bathroom floor. I called out again, louder this time, but there was still no response. The items looked recently used. There was an open notebook with fresh writing and a half-empty water bottle that still had condensation on it. Whoever these things belonged to couldn't have been gone for long. A chill ran down my spine as I surveyed the scene. Something about this felt very wrong. Why would someone leave all their possessions in a public restroom, and where had they gone? I debated what to do next. Part of me wanted to just leave, to get back in my truck and drive as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be in trouble. What if the owner of these items had gotten sick or injured and wandered off in confusion? I couldn't just leave without at least trying to find them. Reluctantly, I stepped back outside, sweeping my flashlight across the rest area. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating empty picnic tables and overgrown grass. I walked the perimeter of the building, calling out every few steps, but there was no sign of anyone. As I rounded the corner back to the parking lot, a movement caught my eye. It was just a flicker, a shadow shifting near the edge of the woods that bordered the rest area. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I raised my flashlight, trying to see what had moved, but there was nothing there. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining my eyes and ears for any sign of movement or sound. But there was nothing, just the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant hum of the highway. Shaken, I hurried back to my truck, looking over my shoulder every few steps. As I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had I really seen something move, or was my tired mind playing tricks on me? I knew I should probably call the police or at least report the abandoned belongings to someone. But as I reached for my phone, I realized I had no signal. Of course, I thought. Just my luck to find myself in a creepy situation with no way to call for help. Sleep was out of the question now. Despite my exhaustion, adrenaline was coursing through my veins, every nerve on high alert. I started up the truck, the familiar rumble of the engine providing a small measure of comfort. As I pulled out of the rest stop and back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something sinister. The rest of the night passed in a blur of caffeine and paranoia. I drove straight through to North Platte, not daring to stop again until I reached the well-lit, busy truck stop there. As I filled up my thermos with strong black coffee, I overheard a couple of other drivers talking. They were discussing strange occurrences at rest stops along I-80. One of them mentioned hearing about a place where travelers had reported finding abandoned belongings, but no people. My blood ran cold as I realized they were talking about the very rest stop I'd just left. I joined their conversation, sharing my experience from earlier that night. They listened intently, nodding and exchanging knowing looks. Apparently, I wasn't the first to have a creepy encounter at that particular rest area. One of the older drivers, a grizzled veteran of the roads, told me that there had been rumors circulating for months about that spot. Some said it was being used by a gang to rob unsuspecting travelers. Others whispered about darker possibilities, human trafficking or worse. The more we talked, the more uneasy I became. How long had this been going on? And why hadn't the authorities done anything about it? The other drivers shared my frustration, but they also warned me about the realities of life on the road. Sometimes, they said, things happen out here that never make it into official reports or news stories. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the truck stop, I decided to report my experience to the State Highway Patrol. The officer I spoke to took my statement, but I could tell from his tone that he didn't expect much to come of it. He thanked me for the information and said they'd look into it, but I left the conversation feeling unsatisfied. That experience changed the way I approached my job. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I started researching the routes I was taking more thoroughly, paying attention to reports from other drivers about potential dangers or suspicious activities. I also became more involved in the trucking community. I joined online forums where drivers shared information about road conditions, safe rest stops, and potential hazards. It was comforting to know that there was a network of people out there looking out for each other, sharing experiences and warnings. In the weeks and months that followed, I kept an ear out for any news about that rest stop. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers of similar incidents, abandoned belongings, strange sightings, unexplained noises, but nothing concrete ever seemed to come of it. It was as if the place existed in some kind of limbo, acknowledged as dangerous by those of us on the road, but overlooked by the authorities who should have been investigating. Looking back, I often wonder about the owner of those abandoned belongings. Who were they? What had happened to them? Had they managed to escape whatever danger they were in? Or had they become another statistic, another missing person whose disappearance would never be solved? These questions haunted me, especially on long night drives when the road stretched endlessly before me and my mind had too much time to wander. I found myself imagining scenarios, trying to piece together the puzzle of what might have happened at that rest stop. Maybe it was a traveler who had been ambushed, forced to leave their belongings behind as they fled from attackers. Or perhaps it was someone in trouble, someone who had reached out for help, but found none in that isolated spot. The possibilities were endless, and none of them were good. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.